Okay, I'm just sharing my screen. I'm hoping everybody can see that. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that's fine.
Perfect. So look, as Vika said, the conversation we're going to have today is data governance and protection in the era of generative AI. I really wanted to set the scene on the conversation we're going to have today. And I guess this is only a few slides that will help you sort of understand the structure and how we've thought about that. But this is really a conversation that Arnie and I are going to have. I come from this from a practitioner perspective. I've been a practicing CIO and CISO for the past 20 odd years, very heavily in the banking and finance space. So probably 20 years in banking and finance, all around the globe in Europe, the US, and here in Australia. Um, Arnie, obviously, very much in the product technology, product solution space. So we'll have a different perspective on things, which I think will be good, and we'll pick at these things. And our goal is to leave you with one or two actionable things you can go away with and start making some changes in your organization, or take action on in your organization, or at least spawn a conversation. So look, let's get into it. Let's talk about the last 12 to 24 months. There's been a massive shift here in terms of how generative AI and LLMs are being used. More and more so, we're seeing these things are being used in operation. They're no longer experimental. Maybe 24 months ago, it was very much experimental, but we're seeing a lot of customers and across the industry, we're seeing this stuff being used in operation. And this is good. It's delivering a lot of value for organizations. It's transforming business models. It's also creating new opportunities, new jobs, new roles, new markets that didn't exist before. But this is going to come at a challenge. It's a bit like anything. It's like cloud computing. When cloud computing came along, the technology world evolved, the business world evolved. We pushed into cloud computing, we pushed into SaaS, and that changed the way we did our business and our organizations thought about driving customer value. Generative AI is going to be the same. But what I think is really interesting with generative AI is historically, our customers used to ask us, how secure is your application? Can I trust you with my data? That conversation of, can I trust you with my data? That isn't going to change. But the conversation or the question on how secure is your application, that's going to change to, can we trust your AI? And that's the narrative, that's the conversation, that's the dialogue that we're going to be having with our customers in future. And organizations that can embrace innovation, accelerate the use of this great capability, and be able to demonstrate that to their customers that they can trust their AI, they are the ones who are going to win. Those who can't do that are the ones who are going to be left behind. So I think trust is going to be the new currency of the future. And we're going to hear more and more of that conversation. We hear about it now. And I'm going to leave you with a terminology, if you haven't heard it already, is trust infrastructure. People are now talking about, well, what's the trust infrastructure that we have to enable generative AI and LLMs and transform our business? And that trust infrastructure has got the same priority or the same level of importance as cloud and AI more broadly. But what is trust infrastructure? Trust infrastructure is the technology, the products, the processes that we put in place to demonstrate that we can trust the information that's being used in the model to make the right outcome. And that trust infrastructure is underpinned by data governance. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. When I think about it, I think of three interconnected tensions. One is the generative AI and LLMs themselves. We're talking about these models that are trained on huge amounts, vast amounts of data, unverified data, differentiated or undifferentiated data. They create content, they make decisions, they take autonomous activity or autonomous actions. Those outcomes, or the way it thinks, can lead to issues such as bias or inaccuracies. We've all heard about hallucinations. So what does that mean to a business and an organization? We're going to dig into that. I think about the regulatory challenge from a India-specific perspective. I think about DPDP. Right? Think about DPDP. You've got mandates around granular consent, lawful purpose, right to nominate. We're going to dig into those things shortly. And we're going to talk about some of those complexities and how you might want to be thinking about that. We're going to also talk about governance or data governance redefined. Moving beyond just a data lifecycle policy or a way we think about it, we need to operationalize this, and we need to operationalize it in real time. The way that generative AI and LLMs are transforming the pace at which we do business, we need to be able to execute on this data governance, this data lifecycle management problem. We need to do it in real time, and we need to have high confidence in that. I also want to talk a little bit about my experience in banking and finance. If we think about banks, we're going to talk about some of the high-risk data that they deal with and what are the impacts there. I also want to talk about some of the core tenets of explainability and fairness in business and in banking. We're going to talk about the consequence of error, the regulatory sanctions, the fines, the loss of customer trust. And I'm going to talk about one of my personal experiences for a bank where we used AI, which had bias, and how that led to regulatory sanction for unfair lending practices. So this is the agenda we have. Hopefully that set the scene. Hopefully you're excited for that. Like I say, I'm really hoping that we can leave you one or two key points that you can walk away with today that you can take some action on. So the agenda, I'm going to dig into Arnie in a minute and ask him about how he's seen this space evolve. Then we're going to talk about some of the product leaders that try to solve this challenge. I'm going to give a perspective on organizational impact and the regulatory challenge and some actions that you can take. And time permitting, we'll dig into a couple of case studies as well. So, look, I think so let's dig into the real conversation. So, Arnie, I'm going to ask you, as somebody who's been in this industry and this space for, many years, you came to Netskope under the acquisition from Docera, and you've seen this whole data governance and data security posture management evolve over many years. You want to give us some of your thoughts about how you've seen that evolve?
Yes, David. I think firstly, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you for having me on this call. So actually, the interesting thing is that the story of data security does not start with security. It starts with how data has evolved over the ages. So if you remember, we used to have servers, and there is still a lot of on-prem servers. And then data was primarily transactional. Like you did a transaction and the data was there with you. And then over a period of time, people realized that that data could be used for other things. And then the data went into the cloud. And with all of these complexities, there was a space where you needed to do three things: find, flag, and fix issues that put your data at risk. And so my journey with Docera and my co-founder, Dr. Noah Johnson, who is a PhD from UC Berkeley, it started in 2019, right? What had happened was my Coinbase account got hacked. And I'm a serial entrepreneur, and it was like, shit, we need to solve this problem, right? And so we started looking at trying to solve this problem from a database, data lake, data warehouse perspective. And I'll come to why there are multiple paths to where we are today. Way back in 2019, Gartner put out a very light paper, and they listed a bunch of vendors. Of course, we were a startup, so our name was not there. And we asked them, we were curious, why are we not there? And we asked them, what is the criteria? And they basically said, any company that can hold inventory about metadata of data is in that list. So it was things like Elation, and almost anybody who was holding a catalog of data was in that, right? And as the years progressed, companies became more focused, and Gartner also evolved. in their definition of this space. So, uh, so DSPM started off with pretty much anybody who could hold data was DSPM. And then our thing was like, what about data catalogs? Are they DSPM too? Because the security piece wasn't there.
Yeah.
So then when you look at today's players, David, what happens is that they have either come from compliance. So this would be the big IDs of the world and the Veronicas of the world who are primarily compliance focused. But the other challenge that they have is some of them are first and second generation technologies, which means that they are better off sometimes on-prem. And they
Mm.
did not think about SaaS, and they did not think about data lakes, and they don't understand query analysis. And when I say query analysis, I'll go there as well. And then uh, and then what happened is there were a bunch of us who were primarily focused on the security perspective, and we came at the same space because this was such a nice space. Everybody was here, right? And so that was the first part of the journey, which is you had first, second, third generation companies all talking about finding and tagging data. Then came the next piece, which is once you have found and discovered and classified data, you would need to protect it. And that's where the current consolidation is happening. Like in 2024, like we were working with 5 different companies, and just like companies were evaluating technologies to acquire, because we were just a handful of us, we were looking for the perfect partners, right? And so out of 5 discussions that we were having, Netscope was the one where we thought that the entire chain got completed. Like, so the way I would kind of position it is, uh, people say, oh, I'm buying DSPM or I'm buying CASB. Forget all of that. I think you should reframe the thinking to, I want to protect my SaaS environment. So what does that need? It needs you to discover and classify data. It needs you to manage your settings and configurations. It needs you to understand sharing from that SaaS platform. It requires you to make sure that sensitive data is not uploaded or sensitive data is not created. And when you look at this, it is not just DSPM, it's DSPM, SSPM, CASB inline, and CASB API. And these together then create the SaaS solution. That's kind of where we are.
Yeah, look, I think before we double click on some of the things you just said, what you've just said, I guess, strikes a chord with me. Um, the way I've thought about data governance, because I don't really think too much about the products themselves. I think about the business problem I need to solve. And in my previous role, I co-chaired the data ethics committee with the chief data officer for the bank. And we thought about data governance, and we had this good data governance model and the data lifecycle. And for me, data protection was a subset of that. And what I really think about is, you know, I think in our industry, particularly coming from things from a security perspective, we think about data protection. To your point, data protection is about once you know what you've got, you know you know what the sensitive data is, I need to protect it, right? But there's a whole bunch of things before that. And how do you delete that, destroy that data in that whole data life cycle? So I think it's a different, if we think about components and products that you spoke about, at the end of the day, there's a bigger business objective there that we need to think about the life cycle of the data from source of record. When is it created? Where does it flow? How is it manipulated? Where does that spawn off to? And what impact does that have? And when does it need to be deleted? So I think there's definitely, as this industry evolves, and we're seeing it now, and I think AI and generative AI and LLMs have exacerbated that or blurred the lines of those conversations. We think about it again very much from a data protection perspective, but there's a much bigger governance piece, and I think you summed it up very, very well in bringing all that stuff together. And so, let's pull the thread on what you were talking about. What do you think is the number one problem to solve then? And why now?
I think, the way to think about it is that evolution of technologies has always been step functions. You don't see a gradual development, at least in technologies as we know it, like digital technologies. In other places, it's a gradual climb, but here we just believe in the steps, right? So, what has happened today, if you took a snapshot, is that there are some internal drivers and there are some external drivers. So, what is an internal driver? So, an internal driver is, let's say there is a large organization or a mid-sized organization. They have, uh, local data stores which are on-prem, and then they decide like we need to take some of our stuff to the cloud, right? Then they realize that the way cloud, hyperscalers make money is by people using more cloud, right?
Mm.
So
Yes.
they've removed any friction that is possible, and so now your developer and your intern can fire up stuff in the cloud, right? So the first one is basically an internal sprawl, right? The second one is that when you think about data, companies are not only gone from transactional data to additional metadata on top of that, but they're also collecting more data with the perspective that it will be mined in the future. So it's like, let me grab as much as I can. So the
Hmm.
quantum of data. And the third one are the types of data that we are capturing today. Some of it is on its own is not risky, but when you start putting strings together, you kind of have, uh, you know, you understand more than people actually are aware of themselves. Like a
Yeah.
company knows more about you than you know about yourself, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so these are some of the internal factors. The other internal factor, which is very, very recent, is AI. Now, AI is a very broad term, and everybody is AI washing everything. But the way to think about it is that you've got data that AI touches and uses, you've got a pipeline through which it flows. Now, these two are kind of static because you know where your data is if you have the right controls in place. If you have secure access, then you know where the data is traveling. But the risky part is that anything that is at the application layer today, like whether it is agents or nifty stuff that people are doing with AI, that's all experiments. And there are 521.7 experiments running that you don't know about. And you may have some sanctioned ones which you're aware of. And so those are just the internal factors. From an external factor perspective, what is most recent right now is the geopolitics,
Hmm.
right? Which means everybody knows that if not today, definitely tomorrow, the government will come and say XYZ data cannot cross over lines. I think it
Yes.
will reach a stage
Yeah.
where even the metadata cannot cross over lines.
Yeah.
So that has led to a bunch of compliance stuff. There is industry focused compliance, and then there are state actors who are different from insider threats to state actors who are going after data, right? And so this has created this perfect storm. And in this perfect storm, uh, and the point is the timing of this storm is not great. Why? Because the investment in exposing the data is high, while the investment in protecting is low. So every single CISO is under budgeted, under resourced, fighting a war of attrition against, I would say, a defender's dilemma. You've got so much, you don't know what
Yeah.
is the
Yeah. Yeah.
best thing to protect.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. That's right. So I think that sort of dovetails nicely into where I'd like to take the conversation because to address and combat some of that, there's going to be some organizational changes we're going to have to think about. So let me give you my perspective on that, and maybe then you can respond to my
Yeah.
perspective and see what you think.
Actually, before you go there, David, why don't I ask you a question around? So everything that I said was at 30,000 foot view, right? It's
Yes.
like, okay, strategically this is happening, at the macro level this is happening. So when you begin to think about organizations, now it comes down to, okay, what are your KRAs? What is your to-do list? What is your punch list, right? How, and you've been a CISO for such a long time in varied geos, which is because every place has a slightly different culture.
Totally. Totally.
What are the things that you think companies need to do to organize themselves to take on this
Uh,
challenge?
yeah, look, good question. Good question. I think fundamentally it sort of comes back to something I mentioned on about the blurring of the lines between data protection and data governance. Let's be really crisp and clear about what each one of those means. So from an organizational perspective, something I found as a CISO, when you're working with business partners and technology partners, we think we're using the same language, or we're using the same language, but we don't have the same need. We don't necessarily have the same meaning. So let's be really clear on things like, what do we mean by data protection? What do we mean by data governance? What do we mean by data lineage? Because all those things are interconnected, but sometimes you can talk past each other, and sometimes you think you're talking about the same thing. So that clarity is absolutely required. I think in the new world, there's also a piece around organizations needing to think about new policy domains that probably haven't existed before. Let's think about agentic AI. Agentic AI is all, is very much going to be about what is the intent of that agent? What's the intent of how that data is being used and what is it trying to achieve? So we've never had that conversation about intent before. How does
Mhm.
intent in terms of the way this data is being handled through this life cycle, how are we going to start to consider that? So I think there's going to be a new shaping in this space when we think about not just how is it being used, but why is it being used? What's the intent and what's the potential knock-on effect of that? So I think that's very, very important. I also think there's some foundational organizational changes. So I'm going to take I mentioned about my previous role where I co-chaired the AI ethics committee with the chief data officer. Here in Netskope, we also have an AI risk governance committee. I think what's really important is organizations need to be standing that up now if they haven't done it already. But that needs to be a central but cross-functional um, capability. So you need representatives from legal, representatives from HR, representatives from technology, from data, from the business. Everyone's going to have a different perspective as this starts to roll out. And we all know the power of diversity and inclusion when it comes to performing teams. I think there's an element that brings that back into that. And what it does is it makes sure that the ethics and the data and the AI responsibility is integrated from the start, right? Just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should do something. And that becomes very relevant when we start talking about DPDP. There's a point in DPDP around you can only use the data for the purpose it was collected for. So we need to be very clear about how we're going to start to manage that. The next piece is
So,
around how do we shift from protection to control? So not just protecting the data, but truly understanding the data flows. Understanding, and I touched on this, I guess, earlier, like what's the source of record? When was it created? When does it need to be deleted? What are where is it being spawned and recreated and used elsewhere, and understanding that data flow. And then you think about a complex organization with many users, many SaaS applications, the permutations of how types of data or how a data set can be used is there's a limitless number of permutations there. So how do we get our hands around that? How do we get that visibility? And I think there's a piece around internal education. We need to train our users, our end users, around how to use LLMs and generative AI responsibly. And you'll hear me talk about responsible AI quite a lot in this conversation. And for me, when I think about responsible AI, I think about bias and fairness. I think about explainability and traceability. So that's probably my
so
start.
yeah, I think those are really, really good points. But because this audience is mostly in India, I will challenge you to kind of look at the things that we discussed uh, with a lens on the DPDPA
Yeah,
regulations that are in place, and
yeah,
what additional things can we bring from other jurisdictions. Like, this is not the first place on the planet where this is happening. So what have you seen outside that can be
yes.
translated by practitioners to make their practice the strongest?
Yeah, look, I think what I've, and I'm sure some of the audience here will scold me for saying this, but when I think of DPDP, it very much reminds me of GDPR that came out of the EU, right? Very, very similar. There's a lot of similarities there. So I think some of these challenges have already been seen before in the EU, but some of the big challenges I think of is, I touched on it before, lawful processing and consent. We can only use that data for the purpose it's been collected for. So how do we define lawful purpose? Right? And what about if the data about an individual or a customer is scraped from the personal web? What's the requirements around that? What if a customer exercises their right to nominate, which is, erase the data? How do you prove that that data has been scrubbed from the training data set? How do you know it's been removed from the models? Sorry, the weights in the models themselves. Right. So this is something that organizations are going to have to figure out how they demonstrate that. This is where true data governance, data lifecycle management, and transparency into that is going to be really, really important. Purpose limitation. So when an LLM is trained on this big, diverse data set, the legitimate purpose of that data needs to be understood. And we need to make sure we're not creeping the use of that data outside of that. You touched on it yourself. You said an organization knows more about you than you do yourself because they've got this enormous amount of data on that. That's what comes back to that ethical question I said. Just because we
Yeah,
can doesn't mean we should. And I remember
exactly.
having these conversations in the bank saying when we had all this customer data, the marketing team wanted to get hold of that so they could figure out how they would sell these other products. Like, well, hang on, just because we can doesn't mean we should. We collected that information for a mortgage, right? Not to sell a credit card, right? So these are the natural tensions that we're going to start to see. Data minimization. I think we've seen a lot of, clearly a core component of DPDP. We've seen a lot of instances around the globe, and I'm going to talk about Australia, where we had two really big data breach incidents in Australia, one with Medibank and one with Optus here in Australia, where data minimization wasn't practiced. They held this superfluous amount of data, and it resulted in massive impact to their customers. Right. So how do we demonstrate that we've collected the data that we needed and we've destroyed that data when we no longer need that? And that's going to be part of that data minimization piece. Accuracy and correction, right? So how do we correct the LLM if it hallucinates? How do we start to manage those impacts? What if the LLM or the generative AI makes a decision that causes harm to a customer, right? How do we start thinking about that? And we've seen that there's multiple use cases where things like that have happened. So I think that's probably from a DPDP perspective, I think there are probably three or four core areas where I think organizations and our audience need to be thinking about hard about how they're going to address those spaces for sure.
Yeah, that's really useful. So, changing gears a little bit, we wanted to spend some time on the how product managers who are building
Yes.
these solutions think about it. So, uh, and I'm happy to share some of my experience
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
As a
Okay.
practitioner, what are the things that you're curious about?
Okay, from a product perspective or more broadly? I guess I'll start at the challenges we'll have, and then maybe you can go into how you think this will work. Right?
Sure.
Let's think about some of those regulatory challenges. So, harmonization, right? How do we start to harmonize DPDP across other critical regulations? We have some conflicting regulations in some places. And then, of course, there's global regulations. You touched on the cross-border transfer piece. I think that's going to come. So how can product and solutions help us manage cross-border data transfer? I think the significant data fiduciary, which is core to DPDP, is understanding, what enhanced obligations that will have. And for a significant data fiduciary, how can we give those accountable parties the visibility and the transparency that they need to be able to make educated and rational decisions? That's probably where I'll start. So maybe you can give me a view on No, what's missing and what would be the ideal solution to try and solve for some of these challenges?
So what I'll do is I will try and share how, as we are building out products, how do we think, right? And how do we think? Because technology is just one piece, and it is not the end all of solving this. So to me, there are two big buckets. The first one is the people bucket, and the second one is the project bucket, right? And for those of you who like buckets of three, both of those have got three and three components. So when you think about the people bucket, what comes to my mind first is mindset. Uh, Second
Mm.
one is methods, and the third one is measurables. So why are these important? Uh, Companies have culture, and each culture decides how permissive or restrictive they are. And so as long as companies think that security is the responsibility of the security team, that is going to be a really long, bad journey, right? So the mindset has to be like all of us who are touching data are responsible for it. Like one way to think about it is everybody says data is as good as money. We have systems to account for how people are spending money, but we don't have systems to measure how people are using data. And now a lot of platforms have that. The second one is methods, which is a lot of times we have this intent, and this intent is like, I want to achieve this, but I don't have the skill set to take it from where we are to where we want to be. And that is where the methods come in. And the project bucket kind of covers that a little bit. And the third piece is measurables. Like if you can't measure it, you cannot improve it. Even if your measures are incorrectly defined at the beginning, does not matter. You can live with a pencil and an eraser and make corrections, but make sure that it is measured, right? On the project side, the key things in that bucket is what I call pre-built. Like before you talk to vendors, before anything else, think about your strategy, think about your objectives, think about the resources, think about the timelines.
Did we lose any? David, you can hear
Yeah,
me, right? Yeah.
yeah, I think we might have. And I, sorry, my video camera stopped working. I had to transition to the one off my laptop. So sorry for the different change of view, audience.
That's fine. Rajesh, maybe you can ping any if you have the number.
I'm going to see if I can get my camera working.
Sorry. Uh, and finally is the post build. In the post build, it's like, what is the feedback that we got? How do we iterate? How do we improve the system? So if you think about the mindset, method, and measurable, and what is pre-build, in-build, and post-build, you will actually be able to think about this in a very structured manner. Like those are the things that I would talk about. Now, let's take this into your world, David.
Yes.
You've been in BFSI, right? And in this sector, there are some specific vertical challenges. And as you do this, it would be great to get a little bit of color, if possible, with actual use cases so that people can visualize. Like otherwise, it's all talk, right? Until you can show that other people have gone through that journey, it's very hard to create benchmarks.
Sure, sure. And Arnie, we lost you there for a minute. I don't know if you heard. For some reason, my video camera has stopped working. I had to transition to the one on my laptop. So sorry apologize for the change in view. It's just one of those technical issues that you can't plan for. All right. Yeah, look, coming back to your question. So look, there's two things from a banking financial services perspective. I think, well, the biggest challenge, I think, is model explainability and fairness. They're the two things, right? So if you think about generative AI and LLMs and the way that they they execute complex tasks. We know, and we've spoken about this, at length in the industry as this is starting to evolve. How do we demonstrate, or how do we demonstrate traceability in the decisions that the model is making? How do we explain those decisions? If we change the training data and ask the same question, does it give us the output that we want? If we ask the same question with the same input data, does it give us the output that we want? How does that vary? Can we explain that variability? These are very critical questions because you don't get the same answer from a model every time you ask it this question. You'll get a variable answer. And we need to be able to understand and explain those variances. And the juxtaposition of that is in banking and finance, regulations often mandate the right for explanation to decisions. So if you're going through and let's talk about mortgages, somebody's applying for a mortgage and they get told no, they're not suitable for that mortgage, they have a right to understand why. We need to be able to explain those decisions. If a model is responsible for making those decisions, we need to be able to understand why it did that, right? So there's an expectation in banking and finance around explainability, and that's been there forever. One of my previous banks, I won't say which one, was using AI to speed up the mortgage application process, and we found there was bias in the model, and that bias resulted in regulatory action, which resulted in unfair lending practices, and it caused harm to our customers. And the term harm is a debatable term anyway, but it was perceived that it caused harm, because it impacts people's lifestyle, people's lives in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's the biggest challenge when I think about generative AI and LLMs and what we need to do. So in terms of what can companies do or what can organizations do to help try and solve for some of that, I think, and we've touched on it before, that data governance, that data lifecycle piece. Let's understand where the data is being collected, why is it being collected, trace the lineage of that data, and understand when it needs to be destroyed. And that end-to-end piece is really, really important. Understanding data lineage, understanding where that data is being used in that decision-making process, understanding where it's being used in the training of the models, and being able to demonstrate that rigorous data lineage piece will underpin an organization's ability to explain how that model is working. So we know that we've known for a while now, and we've known for a long time, that data is critical to the outcome of the models. Right? The models are nothing without that data. As long as we can validate that we understand how that data is being used, that we trust that data, that will underpin how we do that. And why is that? Because of the provenance. It allows organizations to prove that it was collected and processed in compliance with DPDP. So an example of that, the unfair lending practices piece is probably an example. There's probably another one around before organizations or banks start deploying LLMs for financial advice. They need to audit the training data set and make sure that that training set is something that they can trust. And how do we demonstrate that we have high trust and the validity of that data? That's where data lineage comes into it. So that's the big one for me. I also think there's another piece. We all talk about human in the loop. I actually find that funny because we talk about it as an industry, we talk about human in the loop as a control, but that sort of assumes that humans never made mistakes. And let's face it, we've always spoken about human error before this, and now we're saying, well, actually a control for AI is human in the loop. Well, hang on. I might go out on a limb here, but I might say that maybe the models will make better decisions and have less error rates than humans, but that's just me. But there is definitely an expectation and a chain of thought that human in the loop should be used at least for critical functions and critical decision making, right? So I think there's a couple of practical things there that organizations should be thinking about when it comes back to being able to demonstrate. Going back to how I opened this conversation, demonstrate that their customers can trust their AI.
Yeah. So it is in a way like in autopilot, they will want you to keep your hand on the steering. You're not doing anything, but your hand has to be on the steering. It is similar to that. Are there one or two company examples where you can like say, okay, and I think we are on the clock here. So what we do
Yeah.
want to do is wrap it up so we can take some questions. But if there is one or two examples that you can provide, that'll be great.
Yeah, look, conscious of time, let me give at least one. So I think BDO, which is most people might be familiar with BDO. They're an advisory and accounting firm. They're the fifth largest across the globe, 30,000 plus clients. We've helped them solve for some of their trust infrastructure elements. They were on a journey to create AI friendly infrastructure, completely cloud native. But the trust question was absolutely paramount to them. So how will we help them to do that? We help them understand that data lineage, understand the provenance of that data, give complete transparency to understand the data flows and control those data flows. So I think that's a really good example. Very complex organization, complex client base, complex data types, and being able to give them that kind of visibility and transparency, which is transfer them. And that's a public record customer use case. You can go on the Netskope site, you can have a look at our case studies. Very powerful.